It was a busy Monday morning at the airport, the kind of scene you'd expect. Passengers rushing past one another, the hum of announcements echoing through the terminals, and the occasional voice raised in frustration over a delayed flight. But in the middle of all this controlled chaos, an unsettling moment began to unfold at Gate 12. A tall, well-dressed black man stood in line with his boarding pass in hand, his demeanor calm and composed. He had been patiently waiting like everyone else, a small leather briefcase tucked under his arm. But when it was finally his turn to step forward, the gate agent's expression shifted. Her smile faded, replaced by a look of hesitation that could have been mistaken for confusion at first. "Sir, can you step aside for a moment?" she asked, her voice polite but firm. The man raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback, but he complied without protest. He stepped aside, his movements deliberate, his posture unwavering. Passengers behind him exchanged curious glances, some whispering among themselves. Others shuffled forward, eager to get to their seats and not give the situation another thought. Minutes turned into an awkward standstill as another agent joined the first. They huddled together, whispering, occasionally glancing at the man as if they were unsure of what to do next. The man remained silent, his dark eyes scanning the scene with a calm intensity that hinted at more than just mild irritation. What began as a quiet exchange quickly caught the attention of onlookers. The whispers grew louder, passengers craning their necks to get a better view. A man in a baseball cap muttered to his wife, "What do you think he did? Must be something serious." "Sir, we just need to verify something," the second agent finally said, her tone almost apologetic, but laced with a nervous edge. "Verify what?" the man asked, his voice steady, though there was a trace of steel behind his words. "I've shown you my boarding pass. My ID was checked at security. What more do you need?" Before the agents could respond, a third figure joined the scene, this time a supervisor. He wore a crisp suit, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights, and his arrival only seemed to heighten the tension. "Is there a problem here?" the supervisor asked, his gaze bouncing between the man and the gate agents. For a moment, no one answered. The silence was heavy, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Finally, the first agent spoke up, her voice barely audible. "We need to confirm his credentials." The supervisor's brow furrowed as he looked at the man, who stood there unmoving, his expression unreadable. "Sir," he began cautiously, "can I have your full name, please?" The man handed over his ID without a word, his movements measured, his face unreadable. The supervisor glanced at the card, his expression tightening as he read the name. A flicker of something, shock, recognition, crossed his face before he quickly masked it. "Excuse me for one moment," the supervisor said, his voice suddenly brisk, as he stepped away with the ID in hand. As the minutes dragged on, the man remained where he was, his silence drawing even more attention from the growing crowd of passengers. Some had their phones out now, snapping pictures or recording snippets of video, their curiosity piqued. When the supervisor returned, his demeanor had completely changed. His face was pale, and his previously authoritative tone had softened to one of unmistakable deference. "Mister," he began, but his voice faltered. Clearing his throat, he tried again. "I sincerely apologize for the inconvenience. There seems to have been a misunderstanding." The tension in the air was palpable as everyone waited for the man's response. But he didn't say a word, instead raising an eyebrow as if to say, "Go on, asterisk." And that's when the panic truly set in. The supervisor cleared his throat again, clearly flustered. His hands trembled slightly as he handed back the ID, his earlier confidence now replaced by something bordering on unease. Passengers nearby exchanged puzzled looks, their curiosity growing with every passing second. "Mr. Daniels, please accept our sincerest apologies. There's been an unfortunate mix-up." His words were rushed, but his tone was almost pleading, as though he were desperate to smooth things over before it escalated further. The man, Mr. Daniels remained silent. He studied the supervisor with the same calm, unblinking intensity he had shown from the start. His silence was unnerving, not because it was loud, but because it was steady and deliberate. It was the kind of silence that made you question everything about the situation, even if you weren't involved. A woman in the crowd muttered to her companion, "What do you think they found? He's not acting like someone in trouble." "Exactly," the other whispered back. "He's too calm, like he knows something they don't." Meanwhile, the gate agents were retreating into the background, visibly relieved to hand the situation over to their superior. The supervisor glanced nervously at the growing crowd, clearly aware that they were now under the microscope. He leaned closer to Mr. Daniels, lowering his voice as if trying to make the conversation less public. "Sir, if you'd like, we can escort you to the VIP lounge while we sort this out. I assure you we'll make this right." For the first time, Mr. Daniels spoke again, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Sort what out? My credentials are valid. My ticket is legitimate. The only thing you're sorting out is why you assumed I didn't belong here in the first place." The supervisor flinched, his professionalism faltering under the weight of the pointed remark. "It's not that, sir," he stammered. "It's just protocol. We have certain procedures in place." "Procedures?" Mr. Daniels interrupted, his tone colder now. "Procedures that only seem to apply to certain people." The crowd murmured louder at this, some passengers nodding in agreement while others shifted uncomfortably. The tension in the air was now electric, crackling with unspoken questions and growing suspicions. As if on cue, two security personnel approached, summoned by someone in the background. They were clearly briefed but looked hesitant as they approached Mr. Daniels. One of them, a middle-aged man with a serious expression, stepped forward. "Sir, we'd like to have a word with you in private," the guard said, his voice firm but not hostile. "Anything you have to say to me," Mr. Daniels replied, his voice steady, "you can say right here." The guard hesitated, glancing at the supervisor, who gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The other guard, a younger woman, spoke up, her tone softer. "We're just trying to make sure everything checks out. It's for your safety as well as everyone else's." "Interesting choice of words," Mr. Daniels said, raising an eyebrow. "Safety." The older guard shifted uncomfortably, clearly uncertain how to proceed. The supervisor jumped back in, his tone desperate to regain control. "We truly mean no offense, sir. It's just that your name, it raised a flag in the system. We didn't realize who you were." That last sentence hung in the air, sending ripples through the crowd. If the tension before had been palpable, now it was suffocating. Whispers erupted all around. Who is *he? Why does his name matter? Do you think he's famous? A politician or something? The speculation only added fuel to the fire, and Mr. Daniels seemed to sense it. He sighed, running a hand over his neatly trimmed beard, as though weighing his options. Finally, he stepped closer to the supervisor, leaning in just enough that his words wouldn't carry far. "Let me guess," he said quietly but firmly. "You scanned my name, flagged it for further review, and now you're scrambling because you didn't do your homework. Am I right?" The supervisor opened his mouth to respond but faltered, his face betraying the truth before any words could. Mr. Daniels gave a small, humorless smile. "Thought so," he said, his voice tinged with something that wasn't quite amusement. The younger guard, still watching, suddenly spoke again, her curiosity getting the better of her. "Sir, if you don't mind me asking, who are you exactly?" The question, so direct and yet so simple, seemed to catch even Mr. Daniels off guard. For a moment, he said nothing, his gaze flicking toward the crowd that was still watching intently. "That," he said finally, "is what they're panicking about." The cryptic response only deepened the mystery, and the crowd's whispers grew louder. The older guard motioned for the younger one to stay quiet, but the damage was already done. Everyone was more curious than ever. Meanwhile, the supervisor seemed to be frantically communicating with someone through his earpiece. Every so often, his eyes darted back to Mr. Daniels, the fear in them unmistakable. It was the kind of fear that came from realizing you'd made a colossal mistake, but weren't sure how to fix it. Finally, the supervisor straightened up, attempting to regain his composure. "Mr. Daniels," he said carefully, "your flight is ready to board. You're free to proceed." The sudden shift in tone caught everyone off guard. The crowd buzzed with confusion, and even the guards exchanged puzzled looks. But Mr. Daniels didn't move. "After all that," he said, his voice calm but cutting, "you think I'm just going to walk away without an explanation?" The supervisor's face turned an even paler shade. I can explain everything, but perhaps not here. It's sensitive information, and I'm sure you'd prefer privacy." Mr. Daniels tilted his head slightly, studying the man as if deciding whether he was worth his time. Finally, he nodded once. "Fine, but you'll explain everything." With that, he turned and began walking toward a quieter area of the terminal, the supervisor and security guards trailing behind him like nervous shadows. The crowd watched them go, a mix of curiosity and frustration on their faces. "Guess we'll never know what that was all about," someone muttered. But one thing was clear. Whatever they discovered about Mr. Daniels, it had shaken them to their core, and the mystery of who he really was lingered in the air, unanswered and unrelenting. As Mr. Daniels and the small entourage moved away from the gate, the buzz of the crowd faded into the background. A few curious passengers craned their necks to watch, but most reluctantly returned their attention to their boarding announcements. The group walked briskly toward a quieter section of the terminal, their footsteps echoing in the open space. The supervisor led the way, his movements stiff and purposeful, like a man trying to hold himself together under immense pressure. The two security guards flanked Mr. Daniels, their presence more symbolic than necessary. Mr. Daniels, for his part, remained composed, his stride unhurried, as if he were the one in control of the situation. They stopped near a small conference room tucked away behind a frosted glass door. The supervisor swiped a keycard to unlock it and gestured for Mr. Daniels to step inside. "Please, sir, have a seat," he said, his voice strained but polite. Mr. Daniels glanced around the room before sitting down at the table, his movements deliberate. He placed his briefcase on the table, but didn't open it, resting his hands on the polished wood surface instead. The guards stayed near the door, exchanging uncertain glances as the supervisor took a seat across from Mr. Daniels. "Now," Mr. Daniels said, his voice cutting through the silence, "why didn't you start by telling me why I was singled out?" The supervisor hesitated, his hands fidgeting nervously. He opened his mouth to speak, then stopped, as though searching for the right words. Finally, he sighed. "Sir, I want to sincerely apologize. There was no intention to offend or inconvenience you." "Cut the apologies," Mr. Daniels replied sharply. "I'm not interested in empty words. I want answers. What exactly triggered your so-called protocols?" The supervisor looked down at his hands, his face pale. "Your name came up in our system," he admitted. "It flagged a priority review. At first, we didn't recognize it was you. When we did," he trailed off, visibly uncomfortable. "When you did," Mr. Daniels repeated, leaning back in his chair. "What exactly did you realize?" The supervisor swallowed hard. "Sir, you're listed as a VIP under a confidential designation. High-profile individuals like yourself are flagged for additional security measures, but the specifics, they aren't always clear to frontline staff." Mr. Daniels tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "A VIP," he said slowly. "And that's supposed to explain the circus you just made of my boarding process." The supervisor looked genuinely flustered now. "I'm truly sorry for the misunderstanding. I can assure you it won't happen again." Mr. Daniels didn't respond right away. Instead, he leaned forward, fixing the supervisor with a piercing stare. "You're still not telling me the whole truth," he said quietly. "What aren't you saying?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. The supervisor hesitated, glancing nervously at the guards. Finally, he lowered his voice. "Sir, your profile in our system includes a security notation, something above my clearance level. I was instructed to escalate immediately if your name appeared. Beyond that, I don't know the details." Mr. Daniels' expression darkened, his calm demeanor giving way to a flicker of frustration. "So, you escalated without knowing why? You dragged me out of line and made a scene because of some mutation you don't even understand." "I had no choice," the supervisor admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Daniels sat back, his jaw tightening as he processed the information. The room fell silent, the weight of the revelation pressing down on everyone present. The younger security guard shifted uneasily, breaking the stillness. "Sir," she ventured cautiously, "if it's not too forward, have you been in a situation like this before?" Mr. Daniels turned his gaze toward her, his eyes narrowing slightly. For a moment, it seemed like he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "More times than I care to count." The guard frowned, her curiosity evident. "Why would they flag someone like you? You're not acting like someone who's a threat." "That's because I'm not," Mr. Daniels replied, his voice clipped. "But people like me don't have to be a threat to be treated like one." The guard looked down, embarrassed by her own question, while the older guard gave her a subtle nudge to stay quiet. "You can start by figuring out who put that notation in your system and why," Mr. Daniels interrupted. "Because as far as I'm concerned, this isn't just about a misunderstanding. This is about accountability." The supervisor nodded quickly, eager to appease him. "I'll escalate the matter to a higher-ups immediately. You have my word." Mr. Daniels said nothing, his expression cold and unreadable. He reached for his briefcase and stood, his commanding presence filling the small room. "I'll hold you to that," he said simply before walking toward the door. The guards moved aside to let him pass, their expressions a mix of respect and unease. The supervisor rose from his chair, watching helplessly as Mr. Daniels left the room without another word. Back in the terminal, the atmosphere was quieter but no less tense. Passengers who had witnessed the earlier scene now pretended not to notice as Mr. Daniels strode past them, his expression as composed as ever. But the whispers started up again as soon as he was out of earshot. "Did you see the way they reacted to him? Yeah, it's like they were scared of him or something. Who is that guy?" The mystery of Mr. Daniels lingered long after he boarded his flight, leaving everyone who had crossed his path with more questions than answers. As the plane ascended into the clouds, Mr. Daniels settled into his first-class seat, his briefcase carefully stowed beneath him. He appeared calm, almost unbothered, but anyone paying close attention would notice the tension in his jaw, the subtle clench of his fingers against the armrest. He stared out the window, his reflection faintly visible against the glass, his mind clearly elsewhere. The flight attendants moved through the aisle, their polite smiles masking any curiosity they might have had about the earlier commotion. Most of the other passengers were busy with their own distractions, books, movies, or the endless scrolling of their phones. But a few couldn't help sneaking glances at Mr. Daniels, their curiosity unrelenting. He ignored them, focusing instead on the small tablet in his lap. His fingers moved quickly, typing a sequence of numbers and letters into a secured file. The screen flickered, revealing a document marked confidential. His eyes scanned the contents, his expression unreadable. Meanwhile, back at the airport, the supervisor was pacing in a back office, his phone pressed tightly to his ear. His voice was low but urgent. "Yes, I understand the protocol, but this is different. His name didn't just flag the system, it triggered an override. That's not standard, and you know it." He paused, listening to the voice on the other end. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and he wiped it away with the back of his hand. "No, I didn't tell him everything. Are you kidding me? He was already suspicious enough, but we can't keep this from him for long. He'll find out." The person on the other end said something that made the supervisor flinch. He nodded quickly, even though they couldn't see him. "Understood. I'll handle it. Just make sure this doesn't blow up in our faces." He ended the call and leaned heavily against the desk, his face a mask of worry. At the same time, in a different part of the terminal, a woman sat at a cafe, scrolling through her phone. She had been one of the passengers at Gate 12 and had managed to capture part of the incident on video. Her fingers hovered over the post button, her caption already written. Asterisk, what's the real story behind the man they didn't want to let on the plane? #airport drama asterisk. She hesitated, biting her lip as she thought about the possible fallout. But her curiosity won out, and she hit post. Within minutes, the video began gaining traction, retweets and comments flooding in as people speculated about who Mr. Daniels might be. On board the flight, Mr. Daniels was oblivious to the growing online chatter. He closed his tablet, leaning back in his seat and exhaling deeply. The flight attendant approached, offering him a glass of water. He accepted it with a polite nod, though his mind seemed far from the moment. "Is everything all right, sir?" she asked hesitantly, her tone warm but cautious. "Fine," he replied, his voice steady but distant. The truth was, everything was far from fine. The incident at the gate had stirred up memories he would rather have left buried, memories of other times he had been treated with suspicion, questioned for reasons no one could clearly explain. But this time was different. This time, the reaction had been too extreme, too coordinated, and that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He reached for his briefcase, pulling out a second device, a sleek black phone with no visible branding. It powered on with a quiet hum, the screen displaying an encrypted messaging app. His fingers flew across the keyboard as he typed a single message. Asterisk, they know asterisk. The reply came almost instantly. Asterisk, how much asterisk? Several rows back, a man wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses was pretending to read a magazine, but his eyes kept darting toward Mr. Daniels. He had boarded the flight quietly, blending in with the other passengers, but now his focus was sharp and unwavering. Mr. Daniels seemed to sense the gaze, though he didn't turn around. Instead, he adjusted his position slightly, angling his body to better observe his surroundings without being obvious. His movements were subtle, practiced, like someone used to being watched. As the flight continued, the tension in the cabin seemed to grow, even though most of the passengers were blissfully unaware. The man in the baseball cap kept glancing at his watch, his fingers tapping a steady rhythm against the tray table. And then it happened. A quiet ping from the intercom signaled the captain's voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've received word of a minor issue and will need to make an unscheduled landing. Please remain seated and follow the crew's instructions." The announcement sent a ripple of confusion through the cabin. Passengers exchanged puzzled looks, their murmurs growing louder as they speculated about the nature of the problem. Mr. Daniels' eyes narrowed, his calm exterior giving way to a flicker of suspicion. He glanced toward the man in the baseball cap, whose tapping had stopped abruptly. Their eyes met for the briefest moment, and in that instant, Mr. Daniels knew. This was no ordinary flight, and whatever was waiting for him on the ground, it wasn't going to be good. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane began its descent. The hum of the engines, usually a background noise, seemed louder now, amplifying the tension in the air. The flight attendants moved quickly, but with forced calm, collecting loose items and reminding passengers to fasten their seatbelts. But even their rehearsed professionalism couldn't mask the unease on their faces. Mr. Daniels remained still, his hands resting on the armrests as his eyes flicked toward the window. Outside, the clouds were breaking, revealing the faint glow of city lights below. He could tell they weren't landing at a major airport. The runway they were approaching was too small, the lights too dim. This was deliberate. The man in the baseball cap had shifted in his seat, his posture now rigid. His magazine lay forgotten on the tray table, his hands clenched into tight fists. Mr. Daniels noticed every detail, the tension in the man's shoulders, the subtle way he kept glancing toward the aisle. It was as if he were waiting for a signal, though what kind of signal remained unclear. As the wheels touched down with a jolt, the captain's voice came over the intercom again. "Thank you for your cooperation, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be taxiing to a secure location shortly. Please remain seated until further instructions are provided." The word *secure* hung in the air like a warning. Passengers exchanged nervous glances, their earlier confusion morphing into quiet anxiety. A child's voice piped up from somewhere near the back of the plane. "Mommy, why aren't we at the big airport?" The mother hushed the child quickly, her own face betraying her worry. Mr. Daniels's grip on the armrests tightened. He wasn't a man easily rattled, but this situation was spiraling into territory he hadn't anticipated. The detour wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a carefully orchestrated move. And now, every instinct he had told him to prepare for the worst. The plane came to a stop on an isolated stretch of tarmac. Outside, there were no terminals, no bustling ground crew, just the faint outline of a hangar in the distance and a handful of unmarked vehicles parked nearby. Their headlights pierced the darkness, casting long, eerie shadows against the plane's fuselage. The man in the baseball cap finally moved, reaching for his overhead bag with a swiftness that caught Mr. Daniels' attention. It wasn't the kind of movement one made out of convenience. It was calculated, purposeful. Mr. Daniels leaned slightly to the side, his peripheral vision sharp as he tracked the man's actions. Before the passengers could unbuckle their seatbelts, the flight attendants began walking down the aisle, their faces strained as they tried to maintain composure. "Please remain seated," one of them said firmly, her voice carrying an edge of authority. "We'll be deplaning in small groups. Thank you for your cooperation." Small groups. Mr. Daniels didn't need a manual to know what that meant. This wasn't a routine stop, and whoever had orchestrated this landing wasn't interested in letting everyone off at once. They wanted control, precision, and likely one specific person. Him. As if on cue, two figures appeared at the front of the cabin. They were dressed in plain clothes, neither uniforms nor anything overtly official, but their presence radiated authority. One of them, a tall man with a closely cropped haircut, scanned the passengers with a practiced eye. His gaze lingered for just a second too long when it landed on Mr. Daniels. Row by row, the other figure instructed, her voice calm but firm. Starting from the back. Passengers began murmuring again, their confusion now mixed with unease. Mr. Daniels stayed seated, his face unreadable, though his mind was working at lightning speed. He glanced briefly at the man in the baseball cap, who was now sitting perfectly still, his bag clutched tightly against his chest. The deplaning process was agonizingly slow, each group of passengers escorted off the plane and into the darkness outside. The cabin grew quieter and emptier with every passing minute, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. When it was finally Mr. Daniels' turn, one of the plainclothes figures approached him directly. "Sir," the man said, his tone measured but firm, "we need you to come with us." The eyes of the remaining passengers bore into him, their curiosity palpable, but Mr. Daniels didn't flinch. He rose from his seat with the same calm composure he'd maintained throughout the ordeal, his briefcase in hand. As he walked down the aisle, the man in the baseball cap moved suddenly, stepping into the aisle as if to follow. One of the plainclothed figures raised a hand, stopping him in his tracks. "Sir, please remain seated." Their eyes locked for a brief moment, an unspoken challenge passing between them. The man in the cap hesitated, then slowly sat back down. But his gaze stayed fixed on Mr. Daniels, his expression unreadable. Once outside, the cold night air hit Mr. Daniels like a slap. The unmarked vehicles were closer now, their engines idling softly. Two men in dark suits waited beside one of them, their postures rigid. One of them opened the door, gesturing for Mr. Daniels to step inside. He paused, his eyes scanning the surroundings. Every detail mattered. The positioning of the vehicles, the number of people, the lack of visible insignias. This wasn't a government operation, at least not in the traditional sense. It was something else. As he climbed into the vehicle, The door closed behind him with a heavy thud. The man in the suit seated across from him wasted no time. "Mr. Daniels," he said, his voice smooth and deliberate. "We've been expecting you." For the first time, Mr. Daniels allowed a flicker of emotion to cross his face, confusion mixed with a touch of defiance. "I wasn't aware I had an appointment," he replied evenly. The man leaned forward slightly, his eyes sharp and probing. "You didn't, but when certain names appear on certain lists, we don't leave things to chance. I'm sure you understand." Mr. Daniels didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned back, his expression settling into one of quiet defiance. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice low. The man smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. "It's not about what we want," he said. "It's about what you know. And more importantly, who else knows it?" The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. For the first time, Mr. Daniels felt the weight of what he was up against. This wasn't just about a flagged system or a misunderstanding at the gate. This was something much larger, something far more dangerous. And as the vehicle began to move, carrying him deeper into the unknown, one thing became clear. Whatever secrets he carried, they were worth far more than he had ever imagined. The car sped through the darkened streets, leaving the small airstrip behind. Mr. Daniels sat quietly, his gaze fixed on the man seated across from him. The questions burning in his mind went unspoken, though the weight of the moment was almost suffocating. Outside, the landscape blurred past, and with every passing second, the tension inside the vehicle grew heavier. The man who had addressed him leaned forward slightly, breaking the silence. "You've been under the radar for a long time, Mr. Daniels. Impressive, really, but nothing stays hidden forever." Mr. Daniels tilted his head, his expression calm but his eyes sharp. "Hidden? I didn't realize living my life quietly constituted a crime." "It's not what you've been doing," the man replied, his tone cool. "It's what you know. Or more specifically, what you're carrying." At that, Mr. Daniels' grip on his briefcase tightened ever so slightly. It was a subtle movement, but the man noticed. His smile was thin and knowing. "You've been playing a dangerous game, but now you've been found out, and everyone wants a piece of the prize." The vehicle came to a sudden stop, jolting them both slightly. Outside, a large warehouse loomed, its steel doors illuminated by harsh floodlights. The driver stepped out, opening the door for Mr. Daniels. As he stepped out, the cold night air hit him again, but this time, it was accompanied by the hum of electricity and the faint sound of voices. Inside the warehouse, more men in dark suits waited, their postures tense and alert. A long table stood in the center of the space, and the setup felt deliberate, almost theatrical. "Take a seat," the man instructed, gesturing to one of the chairs. Mr. Daniels hesitated for a fraction of a second before complying, placing his briefcase on the table in front of him. One of the other men stepped forward, his voice sharp and impatient. "Open it." Mr. Daniels leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "What exactly do you think you'll find in there?" "Enough," the man shot back. With deliberate slowness, Mr. Daniels reached for the briefcase, unlocking it with a quiet asterisk click asterisk. He opened it to reveal a sleek tablet, a stack of documents, and a slim black envelope. The man who had escorted him leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he took in the contents. "That's it?" one of the other men asked, his tone skeptical. Mr. Daniels' lips curved into a faint smile. "It's always the things you overlook that matter most." Before they could question him further, the tablet screen lit up with a soft glow. A live feed appeared, showing what seemed to be classified information, documents, images, and a stream of data scrolling rapidly. The men leaned in closer, their expressions shifting from confusion to alarm. "Where did you get this?" the first man demanded, his voice sharp. Mr. Daniels remained calm, his voice steady. "The real question is, why are you so afraid of it being out there?" The room fell silent, the weight of the implications sinking in. The live feed continued, revealing more damning evidence. Details that pointed to corruption, backdoor deals, and actions that could unravel the careers of several powerful individuals. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," one of the men finally said, his voice low. "Oh, I understand perfectly," Mr. Daniels replied. "That's why I'm here. You dragged me out of my life and forced my hand. Now, everyone watching this feed will know the truth." The words hit like a hammer, and panic spread across the faces of the men around the table. "Shut it down," one of them barked, but it was too late. The tablet emitted a small beep, and the feed cut off abruptly. A notification appeared on the screen. Asterisk data successfully transmitted asterisk. The room exploded into chaos. Voices overlapped as the men argued, their composure crumbling under the weight of what had just happened. Mr. Daniels stayed seated, watching the unraveling with a quiet intensity. "You think you've won," one of them growled, turning on him. Mr. Daniels stood, his movements deliberate. "Winning was never the goal," he said. "Exposing the truth was." He picked up his briefcase and began walking toward the door. The men didn't stop him. They were too preoccupied with the fallout of what had just occurred. But just as he reached the exit, the man in the baseball cap emerged from the shadows, blocking his path. For a moment, they stood face to face, the tension between them crackling like electricity. "Who are you really?" the man asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and disbelief. Mr. Daniels' eyes met his, unflinching. "Someone you shouldn't underestimate." And with that, he stepped past the man, disappearing into the night. The warehouse buzzed with chaos behind him, but he didn't look back. The final twist came hours later when news outlets broke the story, revealing the leaked information to the world. But as reporters scrambled to uncover the source, they found nothing, no trace of the man who had made it all possible. Mr. Daniels had vanished, leaving behind only questions and the undeniable proof that sometimes one man can shake the foundations of power without ever firing a shot. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the city stirred to life. Phones buzzed with breaking news alerts, and televisions blared headlines that no one had seen coming. The leaked information sent shockwaves through every corner of the nation, revealing corruption that reached higher and deeper than anyone had dared to imagine. Names were named, transactions exposed, and secrets that had been buried for years were laid bare. Across the city, those implicated scrambled to contain the fallout. Some issued hasty denials, their voices shaking as they faced reporters' relentless questions. Others disappeared entirely, retreating to the shadows in the hopes of avoiding the storm. Social media exploded with outrage, support, and endless speculation about who had dared to blow the whistle. And yet, the man at the center of it all, Mr. Daniels, was nowhere to be found. In a small coffee shop tucked away in a quiet corner of the city, a woman sat by the window, sipping her drink as she scrolled through her phone. She stopped when she came across a video, a snippet from the live feed that had been broadcast the night before. It was blurry and incomplete, but it was enough to spark recognition. Her fingers hovered over the screen, and she hesitated, her mind racing. She had been on that flight. She had seen him. The barista called out her name, snapping her back to the present. She closed the app and picked up her drink, her thoughts lingering on the mysterious man who had captivated the nation. Miles away, in a modest motel room, Mr. Daniels sat at a small desk, staring out the window. His briefcase rested on the bed behind him, its contents now unremarkable. The tablet, wiped clean of all files, lay next to it, as if it were just another piece of luggage. He leaned back in his chair, his expression one of quiet satisfaction mixed with a touch of wariness. He had done what he set out to do, but at a cost. The life he had carefully built, the anonymity he had cherished, was gone. Though his name hadn't been released to the public, those who mattered, the ones in power, knew exactly who he was. The room's phone buzzed softly, a signal that would have gone unnoticed by most. Mr. Daniels reached for it, answering without hesitation, "Yes." A calm voice on the other end spoke, "You're clear. They're scrambling too much to focus on tracking you now. But you know this isn't over. It never is, he replied, his tone matter of fact. There was a brief pause before the voice continued. You did what needed to be done. The world knows the truth now. But you can't stay off the grid forever. Eventually, someone will come looking. I'll be ready, Mr. Daniels said simply before ending the call. He stood, taking one last look around the room before gathering his things. As he stepped outside, the crisp morning air greeted him, carrying with it the promise of a new beginning. Elsewhere, the ripples of his actions continued to spread. Investigations were launched, high-ranking officials were suspended, and activists seized the moment to demand accountability. The people had seen the truth, and they weren't willing to let it be swept under the rug. But amidst the chaos, the question remained, who had done this? Theories ranged from rogue agents to disillusioned insiders, each one wilder than the last. Some even suggested a coordinated effort by an underground network, though no evidence supported such claims. For Mr. Daniels, the anonymity was both a shield and a burden. He had no illusions about what lay ahead. There would be no parades, no public gratitude. His work had always been about the cause, not the recognition. As the days turned into weeks, the headlines shifted, focusing on new scandals and crises. But the impact of Mr. Daniels' actions lingered. Policies were changed, new regulations introduced, and a renewed sense of vigilance took hold among those who had once been complacent. Back in the city, the woman from the coffee shop couldn't shake the feeling that she had seen something important. She began piecing together bits of information, connecting dots that others had overlooked. But every lead she followed seemed to end in the same place, a blank wall, a closed door. It was as if Mr. Daniels had vanished into thin air. One evening, as she sat at her desk, staring at her laptop screen, she received an anonymous message. The subject line read simply, "Thank you for noticing asterisk." She hesitated before opening it. The email contained no text, just an image, a photograph of a sunrise over the city. It was beautiful, serene, and oddly familiar. She stared at it for a long time, a smile slowly forming on her lips. Whoever he was, wherever he had gone, he was still out there. For Mr. Daniels, life moved on in the shadows. He found solace in the quiet moments, in the knowledge that his actions had made a difference. The world was far from perfect, but it was a little closer to the truth because of him. And as he walked through a bustling crowd in a city where no one recognized him, he felt a sense of peace. His journey wasn't over, but for now, it was enough. The world was watching, questioning, demanding more. That was his victory. And for a man like Mr. Daniels, it was the only one that mattered.